This is week 4 of the Open Classroom on Food System Sustainability, Health, and Equity. For those of you for whom this is your first evening, I'm Christopher Lasso, Professor of Public Policy here at Northeastern. And, obviously, we started out the semester, for those of you who are fresher, we started out the semester talking broadly about the dominant food system, or as I like to start out the semester by saying, for most of us, the food system gives us what we want, when we want it, at the price we want to pay. We spent a fair bit of time talking about that food system. The second week, we talked about why we eat, what we eat today and why. And talk about the changes in our sort of how we think about food and how we approach it. Last week, we got into those gaps, food insecurity, domestic food insecurity, amidst plenty. Why are a certain percentage of Americans food insecure, and what are we doing about it? And we have really some interesting insights into the gaps in the food security system, including the fact that some kids didn't have food on weekends, even though they're fed primarily by the school nutrition programs. And what different nonprofits in town are trying to do about it. We're veering a bit away from the local and regional today to really focus on the global, because I don't think we can sort of think about our food system in the United States in exclusion from the global issues of global food security. And obviously, when we think about global food security, we have perhaps in our heads fixed images going back 30, 40, how many years of hunger. As our speakers will speak about today, it's much more complex than that. And it's issues of, how do we ensure secure food supply in today's world, but not only today, but also going forward, 20, 30, 40, 50, how many 100 years, amidst expectations of population growth. I mean, we're not quite back at all of this, but certainly part of those arguments about how much can the world feed, how many people can the world feed is always back behind the back of our minds to talk about global food security. And we really, and just to highlight real quickly before I introduce our guests, let me just talk about what's coming up next. Next week, we'll come back to local, regional, look at food system resilience from the perspective of Boston. That is, what would happen in the food supply in Boston if there was a major disaster that interrupted transportation or energy or whatever. And there's an interesting study done on this, and we're having some of the members of that study here. Sorry about that. And then, obviously, 15th, leveraging regional local, we'll have people from the state government, from the Boston Public Market, and regional providers talking about how we better leverage what we have in this region. And then 22nd, feed the city, again, sort of farm stands, food co-ops, food trucks, etc. And again, it's part of dealing with access issues, part of dealing with just ensuring the local connections more. But tonight, we're going to focus on issues of global food security. And I'm really pleased that we're able to get our two guests tonight. I think two of the most knowledgeable people that I know of in this area of global food security. And in order, they are Robert Pollard. Now, as a political scientist, I have to say, I'm going to embarrass Rob for a second, but in my discipline, there are few people over the last several decades who have cut the swath that Robert has in thinking about and writing about issues of food security, that are domestic, or food policy, whether domestic or global, increasingly global over the years. So I'm really pleased that he was able to join us today. He is currently, it's a little update, he's currently adjunct professor of public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, formerly the Betty Floyd Johnson class of 1944 professor at Wellesley, where he served for 38 years. Yes. 38 years until his retirement in 2015, retirement being in quotation marks. Throughout his career, he's focused on U.S. and global food politics and policy. Again, as I said, from 1975 to 2015, he was professor of political science at Wellesley. He's the author of 6 scholarly books, most recently, Food Politics, What Everyone Needs to Know. And, which I happen to hold on, have my copy here just to show you. I'm embarrassed again. If you need a plug out here. We got Food Politics, what everyone needs to know, which I think is one of the best short volumes around on explaining different issues in food politics. And more recently, a really provocative book, The United States of Excess. Sort of thinking about gluttony. It's called Gluttony, the Dark Side of American Exceptionalism, which I think is a really marvelous sort of exploration of American views on food, sustainability, and energy. So it's a really fascinating book. And those are his two most recent scholarly books. He has been a member of the Board of Agriculture and Natural Resources in the National Research Council of the National Academies, and is a member of the Board of Directors of Windrock International, a nonprofit that was named after Winthrop Rockefeller that focuses on social, agricultural, and environmental issues around the world. He currently serves as chair of the Independent Steering Committee for the Agriculture for Nutrition and Health Research Program at the at the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, otherwise known as CIGAR. Myra's PhD in International Relations at Harvard University. And he'll go first and give us the broad sort of overview of where we are on global food security issues and food politics. He's going to be followed by Timothy Weiss. Timothy is senior researcher at the Small Planet Institute in Cambridge, made famous, for those of you who remember, by Francis Moore Lepay and Anna Lepay. Francis was here 5 years ago in this series. Where he directs the Land and Food Rights Program, and we started there this last fall, just recently. And a senior research fellow at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts. From 2000 to 2016, he directed the Research and Policy Program at Tufts University's Global Development and Environment Institute. His background as an economic journalist and an international development practitioner. His research and writing covers U.S. Farm policy, trade and agricultural development, food prices and biofuels, and agricultural biodiversity. He is author of the coming book, soon to be out, I think, Feeding Illusions, Agribusiness, Family Farms, and the Future of Food. He's previously executive director of Grassroots International and a writer and editor of Dollars and Cents magazine. He's the co-author of Confronting Globalization, Economic Integration, and Popular Resistance in Mexico, among other books. He earned his Master's of Public Policy from Tufts University. So again, we have two really great speakers tonight, two really strong experts on these issues. Without further ado, Robert Barber.
Thank you for the book plugs. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here at this event. It looks like a fascinating series. I wish I could attend them all. Tonight we are looking globally, and what I'm going to do is lay out what I see as some of the most important global trends in food and agriculture. Most of them I find reassuring, and I think we all need a little bit of reassurance these days, so I hope this is a therapeutic benefit for at least some of you, but some of these trends are not so reassuring, particularly when I turn to sub-Saharan Africa. I don't see the kind of progress that I would like to see. For example, this photograph, this young girl is in southern Niger, and this picture was taken about 8 years ago. She is trapped in poverty and hunger because her farming practices are essentially unimproved. She doesn't have any irrigation. She doesn't have any improved seeds. She doesn't have any electrical power. She doesn't have any storage facilities. She doesn't have any veterinary medicine for her animals. And so her income is less than $2 a day. She doesn't have any of the things that farmers in the rest of the world have used to escape poverty and to escape hunger. And there's no guarantee that she's going to get those things anytime soon. Fortunately, she's now the exception rather than the rule. If we look globally at the total number of undernourished people worldwide, going back to 1991, you can see that over the last 25 years, there's been substantial progress in reducing the numbers of undernourished in the world, from more than 1 billion in 1991 to less than 800 million today, a significant decrease, and significant in part because this was a period of rapid population growth overall. So in spite of rapid population growth, the absolute number of hungry people has continued to decline. What I find most interesting about this data, it's from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, is that looking at this data, you would never know that in 2008, the world experienced what journalists at the time were calling a world food crisis. There was a sharp upward spike in the price of food on the world market in 2008, but the widely propagated view at the time that this was driving another 100 million people into hunger was, in retrospect, mostly erroneous for reasons that we could explore if you're curious. But hunger has come down since the 1990s, mostly because poverty has come down. Hunger is driven by poverty. It's the reduction in poverty since the 1990s that has brought down hunger. Back in the 1980s, 40% of all people on Earth were living in deep poverty with incomes of less than $2 a day. 40% back in the 1980s. Today it's only 10%. From 40% down to 10%. This is an escape from poverty that is continuing. In fact, the World Bank now calculates that 250,000 people are escaping deep poverty every day. Every single day, 250,000 people. That's almost 2 million people a week. This is a period of the most rapid reduction in absolute numbers of impoverished people that the world has ever seen. Now, if that can't cheer you up, I can't help you. There's something else going on. But the reduction in absolute poverty makes the present day a reassuring moment in time for me. And with this rapid reduction in poverty, with this growth in income, food consumption is going up as well. The black line at the top is population in the developing world, in the developing world. And these numbers start at 1990 and they go out to a projection to 2050, so be careful where the present time is the center bar. And in the developing world today, there's 5.8 billion people. It's the colored sections of the vertical bars that are most interesting to me. The brown section of that left vertical bar shows that in 1990, there were 480 million people living on less than 2,000 calories a day, which is inadequate, particularly if you're in the countryside doing agricultural labor. Those people were seriously undernourished, 480 million. But notice that that brown bar is shrinking. By 2005, there are only 227 million people in that category. Today, only 104 million people in that category, and projections outward to 2030 show that that bar is going to disappear. That degree of undernutrition is going to be something of the past by 2030. And you can even look at the next bar, the dark green bar, where people are living on between 2,000 and 2,500 kilocalories a day. That bar it's substantial now. It's going to grow for a while as people escape the bottom. But by 2030, that bar is going to be shrinking as well, and by 2050, it's going to be almost gone. So as income increases, the number of people who can't afford an adequate diet are diminishing rapidly. This also is very good news. Now, Chris mentioned Thomas Malthus. This is the past 110 years of history that demonstrates, I think, vividly how seriously erroneous his thinking was. He's the one who said that food production can't possibly keep up with population growth, and so food is going to become increasingly scarce, and we're going to all move toward increased premature death rates, and it's going to be a calamity. Over the last 110 years, you can see that population has increased. He had that right, sort of. But the declining green line is the price of food, the price of agricultural products on the world market. As population has gone up, the real price that people have to pay for agricultural commodities hasn't gone up. It's gone down. It's now less than half as high as it was at the beginning of the 20th century. So the trends are going in exactly the opposite direction from what Malthus predicted. Agricultural commodity prices have been in a long, not a steady decline. Commodity markets, especially international commodity markets, are highly volatile, but they've been in a decline, significant decline, for more than a century now, and there's no end in sight. These data end in 2010. That was at the peak of the so-called world food crisis that I mentioned a while ago. And you can see there is a tiny little upward spike in that green line at the very end of this chart, but now food prices are back down. And so if I had this chart extended out to 2015, the green line would be back below the dotted line long-term trend. So what's made this possible, of course, is an increase in agricultural productivity that's allowed farmers to stay out ahead of food demand. The food demand is coming not just from a wealthy 1%. Food demand is now more broadly based than ever before because income growth is creating now a much larger global middle class. This is World Bank data reported by the Brookings Institution. This compares 2009 to 2030. How do they define middle class? Well, the farmer in that first slide was earning less than $2 a day. This slide defines the global middle class as people who are earning between $10 and $100 a day. Between $10 and $100 a day. In 2009, there were almost 2 billion such people on Earth. This projection shows that by 2030, there'll be not 2 billion such people, but 5 billion such people. More than a doubling of those who are a part of this more prosperous global middle class. You can see that nearly all of the increase in this global middle class between now and 2030 is going to take place in Asia, in this Asia-Pacific region. That's the darker blue color. Well, of course, that's not surprising. 60% of everyone on Earth lives in Asia, and it's a rapidly growing part of the world. So what I find interesting, and what I find a little bit upsetting about this projection, is what's we're seeing in Africa. Africa is the dark brown sliver at the extreme left of these two bars. You can see that between 2009 and 2030, the number of Africans entering the global middle class is going to be minuscule. It's going to be minuscule. By 2030, 1 out of every 5 people on Earth will be living in Africa, and yet very few of them will have entered the global middle class. Very few of them will have even a $10 a day income. And what's the reason for that? I trace this back to the lagging productivity of agricultural labor in Africa. Most Africans live in the countryside. Most Africans depend upon farming or grazing animals for their income. And if the productivity of their labor in those activities doesn't increase, then their income's not going to increase. They're not going to enter the global middle class. How do we assess the growth of productivity in African agriculture? One way to do it is to look at cereal yields. These are cereal yields in different groupings of countries since 1961. The blue line is the developed countries, the red line is the developing countries of Asia, the green line is Latin America. The bottom line is sub-Saharan Africa. You can see that since 1961, cereal production per hectare it's increased, but not very much. And it's falling farther and farther behind from the rest of the world with every year that goes by. In some parts of East Africa, maize yields per hectare today are lower than they were 10 or 15 years ago. This is a persistent problem that has not yet been corrected. And as I said, since 2/3 of Africans make their living as farmers, the failure of farming to become more productive explains a lot of why incomes in Africa have failed to increase. How could you make farming in Africa more productive? Well, if you compare Africa to the rest of the world in terms of fertilizer use, here's one hint at what's not happening that should be happening in Africa. African farmers use only, on average, only about 12 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare, only one-tenth the global average. They don't replace the nutrients that are being mined out of the soil with every crop that they grow. And the rest of the world, fertilizer is used to do that. African farmers don't use fertilizer. Notice Tanzania uses even less fertilizer than the African average. This is why maize yields in Tanzania are only one-tenth as high as they are in the United States or in Europe. Not that Africa should use 120 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. That might be too much, but the African target for fertilizer use is 40 kilograms per hectare. And notice that they're still bumping along at only about 12 and there's no progress. That red line is flat. This, I think, is symptomatic of the persistently unimproved quality of agricultural production in Africa. So why does Africa lag behind? What's the explanation for all this? And a number of different explanations have been provided. Maybe it's a poor resource endowment. Maybe it's political instability and civil war. Maybe it's globalization, multinational corporations, and land grabs. Maybe it's government neglect of the countryside. I come down on the last of these explanations. The first three don't get me very far. As for the resource endowment in Africa, there are parts of Africa that are not suited to crop production, not even suited to grazing. But there are vast areas in Africa, south of the Sahel, from the Guinea Savannah, just south of the Sahel, southward to Mozambique in the west, and to Mozambique in the east, and southward to Angola in the west. Vast areas of Africa have soil and temperature endowments that are just as good as the highly productive regions of the Brazilian Cerrado or the northeast in Thailand. It's not the resource base that's holding back African agriculture. There are parts of Africa that don't get as much rainfall as Brazil, obviously, but Africa has enormous unused water resources. Groundwater resources in Africa are essentially untapped. In some parts of the world, we're pumping too much water for agriculture. In Africa, they have groundwater resources that they're not using at all because nobody's invested in irrigation. Political instability and civil war. yes, that's a problem in a number of countries. In South Sudan today, they're on the brink of famine because of a long-running civil war. But I don't take this as my explanation for why agriculture in Africa is lagging, because you can take a country like Tanzania, where productivity is lagging. Tanzania has never had a civil war. They've never had political instability. It's a functioning democracy. It's not landlocked. Tanzania has all of the advantages that you could think of. It has wonderful resources for agriculture. And yet, maize yields in Tanzania are only 1/10 as high as they are in the United States. Fertilizer use in Tanzania is lower than the African average. So I don't take political instability and civil war as the broader explanation. What about globalization, multinational corporations, and land grabs? I don't buy this either, because rural Africa is probably the least globalized place on the planet. Roads in rural Africa are so poor that international commerce seldom reaches the people living there. In rural Africa, 70% of all residents live more than 2 kilometers from the nearest all-weather road. They simply don't have a road system to engage deeply in globalization. Multinational corporations don't invest in Africa. They don't invest in Africa because they have to pay too many bribes, because they don't get reliable electricity, because a change of government means a change of the rules, because they don't have a road system. There are a lot of reasons why multinational firms have mostly stayed away from Africa. As for land grabs, here I share the concern over insecure land rights for African farmers. I think that's a big problem. But the notion of a land grab is a little bit mistaken. These are mostly land deals, not grabs, and the deals are often negotiated by the African governments themselves. So for me, and sometimes those African governments make the deals that take land away from traditional farmers with African investors. The FAO found out when it studied this problem several years ago that most of the grabbers of land, back when the prices were high in the world market, were actually African investors. So I'll move along. For me, it's government neglect of the countryside that is making the big difference here. This is northern Mozambique. And my friends look at this picture and they say, oh, what a beautiful, unspoiled rural landscape. I look at this picture and I say, that's a poverty trap. That unpaved road is going to be impassable during the rainy season. There's no electricity. There's no irrigation. The modern transportation system consists of carrying something by foot. And it's not even unspoiled. If you look at that hillside in the background, it's been almost completely deforested. Now, what could help Africans escape this kind of problem? Well, they need irrigation, they need electricity, they need paved roads. These are things that governments provide. And yet governments in Africa have failed to do this. Many governments in Africa, most governments in Africa, invest only about 5% of their public budget in any kind of agricultural development, even though more than 60% of the people depend on agriculture for income and employment. And they know it's too little. They admit it. In 2003, they promised that by 2008, they would be investing 10% of their budget in agriculture. But 2008 came and went, and only a handful of countries measured up to that goal. Here's the red line is the 10% target. Look at only 8 countries reached that target. Look at all the countries on the left that are still well below 10%. Many of them still below 5%, and many of them investing a smaller percentage of their budget by 2008 than they had been in 2003. Why African governments behave this way could could be the subject of another lecture. It comes down mostly to the political weakness of farmers in the countryside, most of whom are women, most of whom are not politically organized, they're not armed, they're physically remote from the center of political power. Many of them are illiterate, unable to read or write in any language. This is a powerless group that's easy for governments to ignore and neglect. But let me end by pointing out that our own government has food problems that it's neglecting. In the United States here, the problem isn't eating too little food, it's eating too much food and too much unhealthy food. Notice that the obesity rate in the United States, well, when these data were collected in 2012, it was still under 35%. Now it's, the CDC reported last year, it's 38% of adult Americans are clinically obese. And our government is doing none of the things that governments elsewhere have done to try to keep obesity under check. We don't tax sugar-sweetened beverages. We don't place restrictions on advertising food to children. We can't even remove candy and sugar-sweetened beverages from eligibility for coverage under our food stamp program. Our government is being as neglectful of this problem as African governments are being neglectful of their own problems. So I'll thank you and stop right there.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Bob. That was a great talk. A really good overview of you covered a lot of that, and that's. And I'm really glad to see you focus your attention on the situation in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's where a lot of the research I've been doing on my current project and book is based. Thank you for having me be part of this forum. I'm really pleased to be here. What I want to do here is, Christopher asked if I would sort of give a little bit of background on the book I'm working on, to give a little bit of, stories and context for this discussion. I think it complements Rob's work and presentation very well. In 2009, the food price crisis that Rob referred to prompted me to look at, there were a number of things that changed in that as a result of those price spikes. There's debates about the impacts it had on hunger and malnutrition, but the one thing it did for sure is it vaulted a lot of these agricultural development issues back onto the center of the policy agenda in a really important way. And it kind of put back onto the agenda some questions that had been considered kind of settled. Many of them having to do with the extent of the need for government investment in agriculture, the extent that was needed, and then ongoing debates about the type of that was needed. One of the things it prompted was a recognition that where before people had thought that the sort of going thinking in a globalized world was that if you didn't produce food efficiently, you should just import it and import it cheaply. And the overall trend that produced was, this is for least developed countries, the top darker line is imports and the lighter line is exports. And for least developed countries, you just saw a worsening and worsening of their agricultural trade deficits, which is a sign of import dependency. That became a crisis for some countries when they really found that they couldn't even get the crops that they wanted during those price spikes. That raised alarms and put back on the table the idea that poor countries should grow more of their own food. It wasn't a call for self-sufficiency at all. It was a call for a greater investment in domestic food production. What that meant, it was a turning back in countries like in Sub-Saharan Africa to say, well, actually our small-scale farmers aren't the problem, aren't holding us back from development simply, but they're a resource. They're the ones who are producing most of the food now. We need to invest in that sector. And then the debates became, how do you go about doing that? So I started looking at what the international changes in policies were in response to the food price crisis, which were significant. And then in 2013, I got a fellowship from the Open Society Institute to look in more detail in a select group of countries at how those policy changes were actually playing out. The book I'm working on is, which I'm partway through writing. I wish it was just about to come out. They don't do that. They don't just write themselves somehow. I don't know. But the central question that emerged as I did the research in a number of different countries was that if smallholder food producers grow 70% of the food now in places like sub-Saharan Africa and are themselves a significant share of the poor and the hungry, why are policies regularly bypassing that sector and instead favoring what I call large-scale agricultural solutions to problems? The book, this is an indicative table of contents. Let me just walk you through that, and what I'll do is just talk in a little bit more detail about Malawi, one of the countries that I looked at, because I think it's particularly interesting. And particularly relevant to some of the issues that Rob raised. But this is essentially I'm looking at a lot of what I think are the hot button issues in agricultural development debates that, and Rob referred to some of them. Land rights and seed rights land rights and food rights is the core of my program at the Small Planet Institute, and they feature prominently here in Malawi. I call it the limits of the Green Revolution, but it's the extent to which the provision, the emphasis on getting improved seeds and fertilizers is missing the smallholder and missing the mark for Malawi. In Tanzania and Mozambique, I looked at land grabbing issues, one related to biofuel expansion, another related to soybean expansion in Mozambique. Interestingly, both were kind of failed projects. That land grabbing, I started calling it land giveaways rather than land grabbing for exactly the reasons Rob pointed out, that it's a government giving it away, local and national governments, not just some foreigner coming in and taking over the land. And in Zambia, I look at the issue of what Michigan State researchers have called land-poor farmers in a land-rich country, sort of the land rights question, and why, when there are rich tracts of lands being set aside for large-scale projects, are there also, at the same time, a large number of food producers without enough land to become commercial farmers? Where is the calculation and the policy that could give them secure land rights, get them more land, and get them more productive? And then in another section, I look at what I kind of look at as the problem and the dilemma. Agribusiness versus family farmers is one way to look at it, but it's kind of large-scale agriculture versus investing in small-scale farmers. I look at Iowa, the rise of biofuel markets and financial speculation, and the extent to which those have driven U.S. agriculture and then U.S. agriculture affecting the world. In Mexico, I look at the rise of the effort by multinational firms to get Mexico to allow the production of genetically modified corn, which actually last week, another 3 years into a ban on it from the courts, that ban was upheld, interestingly, in another court ruling, so that's still in place. I look at what I call the false genetically modified food debate, which is really, where anyone who criticizes it is called anti-science. Anyone who doesn't like GM foods is sort of demonized, and I think it poisons the debate over what is a appropriate science. And in India, I look at trade issues because the United States took India to court in the WTO, to the WTO dispute process, over its India's National Food Security Program, arguing that it was an illegal subsidy to farmers. So that's the broad picture of the book. And I say that so that when you have your questions, if there's any of those that you want to ask about, please feel free. But I'll talk mainly about Malawi and what I call the limits of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution, I don't know how much people, if that's a phrase that rings familiar to people. I mean, the Green Revolution was the push in the really 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s to bring a so-called technology package to poor farmers in food insecure regions. It really reached and took hold in parts of Latin America and Asia. It dramatically increased yields in a number of areas, and it basically was premised on the idea that if you could get this kind of technology package, which included improved seeds produced through modern seed breeding, inorganic fertilizers that help them grow those high yields, irrigation, better marketing, roads and storage facilities and the like, and irrigation, that you could significantly increase food production. And that indeed happened. It has its contradictions, but it indeed happened. The Gates Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation launched the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa in 2006, just before food prices spiked, and effectively provided the ready-made answer to the question, how can Africa grow more of its own food? I'm going to argue that there are limits to that answer, and that actually diverting us into just that track is a mistake. But let me talk about what's happened in Malawi. I call it Malawi's sweltering miracle, but it certainly has looked like a significant success. What Malawi did, and you may have read about them, the government before, it's a poor landlocked country right beside, tucked beside Mozambique in southern Africa. The Malawian government, after a series of weather-induced crop failures and food shortages that resulted in massive food aid being needed and famine in a couple of years, said, we're not going to listen to World Bank and International Monetary Fund advice anymore. We're going to subsidize seeds and fertilizer and get it to our small farmers. And they devoted a huge amount of resources to that. It works by giving out coupons that peasant farmers can redeem for high-yielding seeds and inorganic fertilizers, with the government covering the vast majority, not 100% of the cost. So it's a huge subsidy to get those things into people's hands. And by all accounts, it worked. It got a lot more fertilizer. It raised the fertilizer levels in Malawian agriculture significantly, and the production increases that were more than doubling, almost a tripling of production, came largely because of yield increases. So it produced the desired result. When I first came to Malawi, some of the contradictions in that strategy were becoming clearer. The critique of the Alliance for a Green Revolution strategy, well, I mean, there's one, which is that it lacks some significant investments in some of the most basic and important infrastructure, like irrigation. So unlike the first Green Revolution, there isn't really a strong irrigation component. The marketing component isn't as strong. And partly that's the result of governments not being as strong and not putting as many resources into the effort. So it gets boiled down a little bit to a seeds and fertilizer program. And certainly in Malawi, that's what they were subsidizing. The other critique is that small-scale farmers are too poor to afford those inputs on their own. That's why they need the subsidy. There's very little credit, so they don't have access to financing. They can't really borrow money to buy it themselves. And so the question remains whether they would actually be able to afford it, and would they continue these practices if the subsidies went away. The subsidies themselves are hugely expensive for the government. Malawian government spends up to 60% of its agricultural budget on those subsidies. But the other critique is that it tends to subsidize specific products, and in Malawi that means maize, corn, and it means a significant increase in the monocropping of corn, growing corn year after year on the same land, which tends to deplete the soil and tends to create some of the problems that I think Malawi is starting to see in the field. So when I first visited in 2014, production was weakening. The import bills for fertilizer were really high. Malawi, poor countries can only import as much as they export. That gives them the hard currency, the cash to import. Fertilizer is really expensive to import, and in the volumes they were talking about, it was breaking that bank. There was a there's a money flowing in and out, and so there's a lot of opportunity for corruption in programs like that. That was one of the critiques of the World Bank of such programs. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this success was that it didn't translate into significant improvements in health outcomes, in poverty reduction, and in reductions in malnutrition. So 50% of rural residents were still in poverty, 20% were undernourished, 17% of children were underweight, which was more than when the program started. 42% of children were stunted, which is the measure of low height for a child's age, one of the main measures of malnourishment. So the health outcomes, the actual translation of these high production numbers of the main staple in the country really weren't translating into improvements in outcomes. One of my first stops was at the Monsanto outlet, which is right in the capital city of Lilongwe, and which produces a good number of the hybrid maize seeds that are distributed within the program. And the interesting thing that the crop breeder there told me was that their yields were tremendously low on the small farms where they were distributing the seeds, and I was mystified by that. He said they were getting about 1 ton, 1.5 tons per hectare, which a hectare is 2.5 acres. These are really low yields. I mean, these are, I honestly was shocked. I wouldn't have expected in a program like this with improved seeds that you get yields that low. And so I set out to try to figure out why that was happening. I talked to one of Andrew Dowdy, who was a former high up in the ag ministry, and he explained a little bit what was happening. Some of what's happening is that you sort of have 3 different types of maize. Local, they call it composite and hybrid. Composite is really open pollinated varieties of maize that you can replant year after year. Some of them are improved, some of them are not. And what this graph shows is that really where the hybrid seeds that Monsanto is selling are doing well is only when they're getting really the optimal amount of fertilizer. And after that, without that, their benefits were more limited. And And that turned out to be basically the norm in Malawi. Nobody, even through the subsidy program, was getting enough fertilizer to fertilize all of their corn. And so yields lag. And that's pretty much a chronic issue for smallholders, small-scale farmers in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. They don't have the income to buy enough fertilizer to adequately fertilize the land they've got. And because they're growing year on year on this corn, year on year on the same land, they tend to get poor yields. And even when they get increased yields, they tend to slow down. The head of planning at the Ag Ministry, Alex Namona, was surprisingly critical of the program, given that he'd been one of the ones who implemented it and directed it. And what he basically said was that farmers couldn't afford the seeds without the subsidies, and the government increasingly couldn't afford the subsidies. So where it made the technology suddenly look like inappropriate technology in the sense that it was inaccessible to small-scale farmers without cash incomes. He also pointed out that what he feared Malawi was experiencing, he called a yield plateau, which is basically that if you plant the same, particularly we're talking about corn, if you plant corn year after year after year on the same land, you get a decreasing response to fertilizer. It doesn't do as much for you year after year. And he warned that that was happening. That's actually what this graph looked like when we looked a little further, is that the return to fertilizer represented here is actually, it was pretty good early on in the Malawi miracle, but then it's declined since 2010. When I went back last year, things had gotten much worse. The data isn't available on all of these, but the production data was available, and it looked like Malawi was kind of falling off the yield plateau. That was the production of maize in Malawi. Now that was caused by floods in 2015 and serious drought that affected much of southern Africa in 2016. Those are widely seen to be the result of changing climates, which have affected rainfall patterns and affected the length of the growing season, all of those things. But what they stress in the fields in Malawi is that that's the new reality, and that's what we have to adapt to. And we need to adapt to that by making our farms more resilient to that kind of climate change. This particular approach didn't seem to be particularly resilient to climate change. And the reason, as Alex Namona pointed out, was that putting more fertilizer and improved seeds work well with adequate fertilizer, but if you don't have adequate fertilizer, they don't do so much better than local seeds. And if all you do is put more and more fertilizer into soil that's monocrop, the quality of the soil actually doesn't improve over time. It can be like stocking a trout pond with trout, which you can pull trout out of that pond every year, but you're not actually producing a lot of new trout. So much more complex, and actually AGRA and a bunch of the other agencies recognize that much more complex, multifaceted approaches are needed, and they try to promote them. But what's really taken hold is this, in the Green Revolution translation to Malawi at least, is an overemphasis on maize, an overemphasis on improved seeds, on hybrid seeds, and an overemphasis on fertilizer distribution through these subsidies. There are farmers who followed a different strategy, and you can kind of find these examples. I saw these examples wherever I went. this is in central Malawi near the town of Dedza, a community called Lobi. And there are a lot of innovative projects to try to focus more on soil health as the long-term solution to climate change and to malnutrition and to agricultural productivity. And that means intercropping. That means crop rotations if you can afford to, if you have enough land to move crops around. What crop rotations and intercropping does is it builds organic matter in the soil, naturally fixes nitrogen in the soil. It can reduce the amount of inorganic fertilizer you need. It doesn't, if you're growing maize, it doesn't provide you enough fertilizer to do just that, but it can dramatically improve the quality of the soil. With the organic matter in the soil, you get increases in water retention. That's the biggest issue in Malawi right now in southern Africa is soils that can hold water. And that's the most climate resilient thing they can do, is build up soil quality. And so the emphasis in these projects is on soil quality. They also, interestingly, had recovered a type of orange maize, the one on the left there, as well as some other local maize varieties. And it was high in vitamin A. And so there's part of a project to try and increase diet diversity by increasing crop diversity. And they were seeing great results, both in terms of yields and the rest. They were displaying this in the capital city of Lilongwe. A farmer from that community, Evelyn Joamole, actually got the chance to explain the virtues of her native orange maize to Malawi's president, who stopped by this display, Peter Mutharika. And it was indicative that his first question, she told me afterwards, was oh, is that from Monsanto? And again, I think this is part of the problem, that the mindset is that the only innovation is going to come from outside and the only resources are going to come from elsewhere. You can find examples like this everywhere. I was in Mozambique, women-led co-op. They had their own seed bank. They'd had a huge crop failure in maize, but they had enough seeds to grow out a whole new set of seeds for all of their farmers, and because they have irrigation. Like Rob said, that's one of the keys in a place like Southern Africa. It gives you a second crop. That's its main advantage, is you're not just limited to the rainy season crop, you have a second crop, because the rest of the growing conditions are excellent year-round. Beautiful raised beds, beautifully intercropped fields. They've been doing it for a long time. They have markets for their produce. They grow a variety of crops so that when maize fails, they have other crops to eat, and they have other crops to sell. Let me just conclude by saying that I think the challenge that some have pointed out, and Olivier de Schutter, the former special rapporteur on the right to food for the UN, has gone on to form what's called the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And they issued a report last year that I think poses the challenge in interesting ways. It's called From Uniformity to Diversity, a paradigm shift from industrial agriculture to diversified agroecological systems. And what's interesting about it is that they really try to focus on a transition. What would a transition look like if we wanted to really reshape, look at the climate change that's going on, look at the resources of resource-poor farmers, and reshape the agricultural development strategies in sub-Saharan Africa such that they correspond to the resources that are there, build on the food producers who are producing food, and raise that productivity level that Rob so rightly pointed to. Thank you.